All right, we are now live for something new that I decided to start doing, and that is these. We'll do them as monthly for the time being. Maybe we'll start doing more of them later on if there's sufficient demand. Sessions on basics of Stoic philosophy and practice, and I think this can be quite helpful. There's a lot of, let's call them, misunderstandings of what it is that Stoicism teaches, holds, offers to us. And I think that a lot of this is caused by, people relying on soundbite stuff. So, what I'm going to offer here is a not complete deep dive, but at least some well informed discussion about what the Stoics meant by the virtues. And we'll do one of these each month if it's popular enough. Maybe we'll do them every 2 weeks or every week or something like that. So, this is the first one, and welcome everybody to it. I hope that you enjoy it and get something out of it. I'm going to talk for maybe 15 to 20 minutes or so. And, you can leave comments, questions in the chat, and I will be spending a good bit of time answering and addressing those once I get through what it is that I'm going to talk about. And I suspect that some of the questions or comments that people might leave, especially about the virtues, will be answered in the course of the discussion. So let's start with the actual discussion of it. So Stoicism and the four virtues. That's our topic for the day. There's a sort of common statement that we see being made a lot, that Stoicism holds that virtue is the only good, vice the only bad or evil. Strictly speaking, that's not completely true, and that can be a little bit misleading unless we understand what the Stoics mean by virtue and vice. The virtues are absolutely essential to Stoicism, but they do recognize that there are some other good things besides simply virtue. And for example, friendship is a good thing. Now, I think that on this topic, there is absolutely no substitute for going back to the classic Stoic texts and thinkers. And I mean, the good news is almost all of these are available for free. You can find them online, and we ought to spend time reading them in thoughtful, rational, wise ways. And there's several key issues with understanding the range of Stoic perspectives on virtues and vices. I'm just going to approach one of them here thematically. So, and here's the central question. What are the virtues that the Stoics recognize? Why these four virtues? And what are the four virtues we're talking about? They're often called the cardinal virtues: wisdom or prudence, justice, courage, sometimes called bravery, temperance, sometimes called moderation, self-control. These four virtues, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, are acknowledged as the cardinal virtues. And I should point out, this is not an idea that's coming from the Stoics. This is an idea that's already out there and being discussed by a number of different philosophical schools. Remember, too, that Zeno himself was a synthesizer. He didn't just study with Proutase the Cynic. He also studied with the Platonist Academy. He studied with the Megarian school. So I see people are asking some questions. Try to make the questions relevant to what we're talking about here. This is not an AMA. This is directly focused on Stoicism. So coming back to the cardinal virtues, Plato talks about the cardinal virtues. If any of you have ever read the Republic and you got to book 4, you know that those four virtues were talked about there. Also, it's discussed in the Symposium. If you look at the Protagoras, there's 5 virtues being discussed, but Plato tends to lump piety under justice in an interesting way. In the Meno, magnanimity or great souledness gets discussed. The later Platonists, they were pretty clear that there were 4 basic virtues that they were interested in. The Epicureans also reference these four virtues. And you might be very, very surprised if you've gotten the sort of, Epicureans are bad, Stoics are good sort of take that a lot of people have as reading from, say, Epictetus or, popular texts on Stoicism. Seneca actually talks a lot about the Epicureans because he's writing to an Epicurean in the letters on ethics, of course, right? Lucilius is influenced by the Epicureans, and so Seneca is saying, hey, we can draw some good stuff from them. We're going to find other thinkers going on into the Christian Middle Ages who are referencing these cardinal virtues. It's really a commonplace of philosophy. The one major school in ancient times that you can say didn't really discuss the four cardinal virtues as such and make that central to their approach would be, of course, the Aristotelians, who recognized a number of other virtues as well. But those could be rolled under the cardinal virtues, as the Stoics do and as other people do. I would say it's less important that we focus on the origination of the idea. And what we want to do is think about, what do these different schools make of it? So the Platonists do not make the same thing of the virtues as the Stoics do, the Epicureans as well. The Christians that are considering them are going to add their own twist to it. So we want to focus on the Stoics, right? And where do we go for understanding the cardinal virtues in the Stoics? Marcus Aurelius, who's very popular when people first get into Stoicism, and I think some people unfortunately remain content with only reading Marcus. He references the virtues a lot. He doesn't go into any sort of systematic discussion of them. Epictetus, I'm a big fan of Epictetus. He's probably my favorite Stoic, but he's not the place to go to understand the virtues as such, because he's working with other ethical concepts that you could say implicitly include the virtues, but he's not doing a systematic exposition of the virtues. Musonius Rufus, Epictetus's teacher, had a good bit of useful things to say about virtues and vices, in particular in his lectures, number 3, number 4, and then 6 through 8. So he gives us some useful stuff, but it's not going into great depth. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of what Musonius probably wrote. So where should we go then? Well, as I mentioned, Seneca, right? The Stoic who we have the most of, you're going to find in his treatises and in his letters. He is going to tell us a lot about the virtues. So there's some systematic, sometimes even comprehensive discussion of virtues and vices in his letters and treatises. And we also really need to look at the 2 summaries of Stoic doctrine that we have. So one of these is found in Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Philosophers, and specifically in book 7, in the life of Zeno. Diogenes says, well, since I've told you about this guy Zeno, who is the originator of Stoicism, somebody asked a question about that, who's the first Stoic? Well, Zeno, right? That's why Diogenes begins with him. He then says, I'm going to summarize what the Stoics actually believe. And so he provides us with a useful summary there. Another really helpful work is Arius Didymus's epitome of Stoic ethics. Sometimes people who are, citing this will call it Stobaeus. That's not actually the right way to talk about it. Johannes Stobaeus wrote this big compendium that included a whole bunch of things, and among them, Arius Didymus's epitome of Stoic ethics and his epitome of Aristotelian ethics. And so, we go into those. And then another really invaluable source is Cicero. If you're studying Stoicism and you're not reading Cicero because you've heard, well, Cicero isn't a Stoic, you're screwing yourself over, because a lot of what we know about Stoicism, apart from the late period where we have, Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Musonius and a few other people, much of it is coming from Cicero. So you really want to read him. And if you only read one book on Stoics and the virtues, it is his book on duties, where he says, I'm going to present the Stoic position, right? So he's going to be quite important, and I'm going to reference all these people, except for Marcus and Musonius, as we go through. So one of the guiding questions that we can ask that always comes up over and over and over and over again when it comes to Stoics and the virtues is, why do the Stoics only talk about these four virtues? Doesn't that leave a lot of stuff out? Isn't that, you know, isn't that problematic? And the answer, as it so often is in philosophy, is yes and no, right? We don't want to take a knee-jerk, immediate reaction. If you look at things carefully, you find out that matters are usually a lot more complicated than they originally seem. So there's a couple things that we can say here. Are the Stoics leaving anything out? And we can say, yes, they are in fact leaving some things out that other people call virtues. And why are the Stoics leaving them out? They don't think they're virtues. So, for example, the Aristotelians, they have this virtue that they call Proutase, which means good temper, mildness, gentleness. There's a lot of translations, and it has to do with feeling anger and acting on anger in the right way towards the right people to the right degree, all those sorts of things that if you know about Aristotelian ethics, you're already probably quite familiar with the virtuous mean. The Stoics say that there is no virtuous mean with respect to anger. Anger is bad. So there's no virtue that has to do with the right amount. Christians bringing in the theological virtues like faith and hope and charity, as well as other things considered virtuous, like, fear of God, which is coming from the, Hebrew scriptures and stuff like that. Those can be considered virtues. And humility is another great example one, humilius mens or humilitas in the Latin literature. Those are not things that the Stoics see as virtuous, right? And could they open up to that? Well, when it comes to faith, fides, you're going to notice that that actually does get discussed as a virtue by both Seneca and Cicero, but they don't mean the same thing that Christians mean by it, right? We could even look at more contemporary discussions of virtues. One prime example of something that a Stoic would not go along with, Ayn Rand in her objectivist ethics, she has a whole bunch of things she calls virtues. The Stoics would say, yeah, those aren't virtues at all. They're on the wrong basis. So that's the, is there something being left out? Yes, there is something being left outside. But then you can say, okay, I get that. There seem to be a lot of legitimate virtues that ought to be recognized by Stoics, but aren't being put in this list of four. So the most common objection that I see is, what about kindness? Isn't kindness a virtue? Being nice to other people, benevolence? Why don't the Stoics acknowledge this? And if you think about the caricature of what Stoics are like, hands off, stick to themselves, uncommitted, detached from things, cold and rule bound. Well, that could feed into that. But that's not, if you actually read Stoic literature, that is not what Stoics are like at all. Read Seneca and you'll see him talking about, friendship and the warmness and, fellow feeling. Read Marcus and he says, love other people, right? So clearly there's something there. And you can say, well, why aren't they talking about it? It's not in prudence. It's not in justice. It's not in courage. It's not in temperance. And the answer is, actually, it is in justice. The Stoic conception of justice includes benevolence or kindness or generosity. Cicero will actually use all three terms that correspond to all three of those words, telling us about the other half of justice. So we can ask our question, well, why don't people know about this? And this is where reading actual Stoic texts would help you out, right? You're going to hear me say this over and over and over again. There is no substitute for actually reading and rereading, not only with the Stoics, but with any philosophy. If you want to talk about, somebody brought up Spinoza, Don't rely on, encyclopedia entries or glosses or stuff like that. You got to read the actual text, right? If you want to talk about Hegel, you got to read the actual text, and it's probably going to require reading and rereading. So let's think about what's included in these virtues. Later on in other sessions, we'll go into, other topics having to deal with the virtues, like them being kind of like off-on switches, and we'll do deeper dives on each of these 4 virtues. But we're already getting close to the end of the time I allotted myself. So I do want to try to get through this. We might actually go a little bit over. So why these 4 virtues in particular? So they do not relate to the Platonic tripartite soul. The Stoics have a different anthropology. They're not getting it in the same way that Plato is. They're doing something different with this. Each virtue has its own, you could say, function for the human being, a determinate kind of goodness that we human beings need, that develops out of and develops our distinctively human nature. So I've got a few passages from some of the people I've mentioned that I think are, helpful starting points. These are not to be understood as like the be all and end all on the virtues, but Cicero in On Duties, Book 1, says that all that is morally right arises from one of 4 sources. It is concerned either with the full perception and intelligent development of the true, so that's wisdom, right? Or with the conservation of organized society, rendering to every person their due, and the faithful discharge of obligations assumed, that's justice. With the greatness and strength of a noble and invincible spirit, that's courage, which includes magnanimity. And with the orderliness and moderation of everything that is said and done, wherein consists temperance and self-control, temperance, right? So Cicero thinks that these stem from our very human nature, what it is that makes us distinctively human, the kind of animal that we are, rational and social animals. In letter 120, I noticed somebody was asking like what letters to look at for Seneca. Well, letter 120 is a really important one. He tells us the desires had to be reined in, right? Temperance, fear to be suppressed, okay, courage, proper actions to be arranged, that's wisdom, debts to be paid. Therefore, we included self-restraint, bravery, prudence, and justice, assigning to each quality its special function. Arius Didymus, who, and you notice there's different translations of these Greek terms and Latin terms, says, and this is in section 5b2, intelligence or wisdom deals with appropriate acts or duties. Self-restraint deals with a person's impulses. Bravery deals with acts of endurance. Justice deals with the apportioning of what is due. Now, this is a treatment of the virtues that is going to be very influential. You'll notice that a lot of medieval Christian thinkers, like, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who are not Stoics, will use this kind of approach, which they're taking from Seneca or from Cicero because they had access to those texts. And they thought that this was a good summary of like the full scope of virtue, the things that we need. If we look at the actual virtues, the Stoics think that the virtues are sort of like big baskets or big brackets that include a whole bunch of parts, you could say, or aspects, however you want to think about them. So if we look at wisdom or intelligence or prudence, Arius Didymus tells us that there's 6 different sub-virtues. And, I'm going to give you the Greek terms, and then we'll talk about, the English translation, which we could use other words to translate. And there are some glosses that are provided. I'll just give you one of these. So, for example, soundness of judgment is a knowledge of what sort of things to do and how to do them so we will act expediently. So it's an aspect of prudence or wisdom. So they mention eubolia, soundness of judgment. Diogenes Laertes also mentions that as part of wisdom. Eulogista, circumspection, being able to, mark things off properly. Anchinoion, shrewdness, also mentioned by Diogenes Laertes. Nun echea, literally like having a brain, sensibleness. Eustochion, soundness of aim, and eumechanion, or mechania, ingenuity, right? And each of these is a part or an aspect of wisdom. Diogenes Laertes adds sunesis, understanding, right? So we've got at least 7 different components of the virtue of wisdom or intelligence or prudence, each of which is its own sub virtue. And there's a lot more if we bring in Seneca and Cicero and people like that. What about temperance? Really, really central virtue. Arius talks about 4 different parts to this. Eutaxia, orderliness, also mentioned by Diogenes in section 126. Kosmiotes, propriety, mentioned by Diogenes. Eidomosune, which is coming from the word eidos, which means shame or bashfulness. Modesty, this is very important. And then enkrateia, self-control, also mentioned by Diogenes. So we've got at least 4 different aspects of temperance being talked about there. Courage is a really interesting virtue. It includes a lot of stuff. So Arius talks about 5 different aspects of this. Carteria, perseverance, is how we often translate that. That's also mentioned by Diogenes. Tharoloites, intrepidness, being confident is another way of translating that. Megalopsychia. This is a really, really important thing that Aristotle considers to be a separate virtue, but the Stoics place under courage. It means great souledness. It means rising above. It means, not letting things drag you down to the level of the common. Diogenes Laertes also mentions this, and Cicero makes a lot of this in his discussion of courage. He almost uses these as synonyms. Eupsychion, stout-heartedness, being able to put up with these sorts of things. And then finally, philoponia, industriousness. Applying yourself to your work is a kind of courage for the Stoics. Isn't that interesting? Diogenes Laertes adds 2 other terms here, apalaxia, constancy, and eutonia, vigor. Constancy is also another big theme for the Stoics. Constantia in Latin falls under courage. And all of these have to do not just like mastering fear, but with like sticking to what you need to do, right? Cicero will also bring in control not only of fear, but of anger, desire, and a few other emotions in his discussion of courage. And then finally, we get to justice. So again, Arius divides up justice into 4 different kinds of things. Eusebia, piety, right? The proper relation to the divine. Chrestotes can be translated as kindness, being useful for other people. Eukoinonia comes from the word koinos, the koinonia, sharing, having community. Eukoinonia gets translated, I think this is a nice one, good fellowship. And then finally, eusonolexia, fair dealing, giving people what they deserve, what we typically think of as justice, right? So you notice that for Arius, these other aspects of justice that have to do with being good to other people are really, really central. Cicero in On Duties will say this virtue that has to do with other people has to do with 2 sides. One we call justice, justitia. The other we have 3 different words for. We could call it beneficence, beneficentia, benignitas, being good to other people, and liberalitas, which means generosity towards other people. That is just as much a part of virtue as is fulfilling contracts or, apportioning things rightly. Cicero also goes on to tell us the foundation of justice is good faith, which is fides, right? Remember I said Christianity has, these theological virtues? Well, the ancients also talked about fides, and it includes truth and fidelity to promises, veritas constantia, right? I'm going to finish up here by talking about another letter. Somebody had asked, what letters to look at in Seneca. So letter 88, this is another important one where he's talking about the liberal arts. And he says, Let's make a survey of the virtues one by one. Courage, fortitudo in Latin. Loyalty, fides. Self-control, temperantia. Kindness, humanitas. Honesty, simplicitas. Temperance, modestia. Moderation, translated by the very close word, moderatia. Frugality, frugalitas. Thrift, parsimmonia. And now notice this last one, clemency, clemencia. These are all things that are not being necessarily discussed by these other authors. What does this show us? Here's where I'm going to wrap up and I'll start answering some of these questions. The Stoic conception of these four cardinal virtues is quite complex, and it includes a lot of things. And not every Stoic author or summarizer of Stoic doctrine has the same list. We should include these with, these various lists within the scope of that. As I've done, for example, if you look up my article that I published in Medium a while back on what is actually courage for the Stoics, we do that. We look at what each of these people has to say about it. So we have to put together a composite picture. This can only be done if you're either actually reading Stoic texts or you're relying on good, faithful discussions in the present day or previously of other people of Stoic doctrines, but you don't know whether they're actually good unless you read the texts. So, I mentioned that I would stress this at several points. That's probably stressed enough. Now let's take a look at some of the questions and comments that we have. All right. So Mark said, the tripartite division of soul is the Stoic virtues. So I mentioned earlier, Plato has a tripartite division of soul into the logical or rational part, the thumatic part, a middle part, and then the appetites, which are multiple. And by the way, it's not the same thing as Freud's tripartite division into id, ego, superego. A lot of people, like to blur those together. The Stoics are doing something different in their anthropology. They think that we have basically one part that does the reasoning, and that is also the part with which we feel emotions and desires. So the virtues for the Stoics are being worked out on a different basis than we find in Plato's Republic, book 5. As is says, what is the popular alternative to Stoicism? There is no popular alternative to Stoicism. Either you're actually like practicing Stoicism, that's part of why we have these things, or you're not. And there's a lot of, you could say, fake Stoicisms, and I use that word very deliberately. There's what we call broicism, the emphasis on hypermasculinity that is anti-Stoic. If you actually look at what the Stoics say about courage, these people who are like taking cold showers and talking about how tough they are and manliness and stuff like that, they're not Stoics remotely. They're actually contrary to what Stoics teach. Or, the people who are all about life hacks and stuff like that, not a substitute for Stoicism. And a lot of those life hacks outside of a proper context will actually screw you up and get you stuck in bad habits. The virtues are dispositions, by the way. You develop them by working on them. If you develop the wrong sort of habits, you're screwing yourself, So I wouldn't try to look for any sort of popular alternative to Stoicism unless you want to go off base, right? Raptor asks, can you recommend specific letters Seneca works with that have the most meat on the virtues? I mentioned a few of them. There's a number of other ones. The easiest thing to do is just get Seneca and look in the index when it comes to virtues, right? And you'll find a bunch of them. A lot of them are towards the end of the letter collection. One of them that I really, really like, I think there's one that has to do, and I'm blanking on the name, with how we came to see these things as virtues. And he talks about grasping them by seeing people who actually exercise them to some degree. Cicero also says a similar thing. Somebody doesn't have to be perfect to be virtuous, right? No, some of the Stoics think that if you've got the virtue, you've got the virtue like 100%. Seneca and Cicero are a little bit more realistic about that. All right. So Warren asks thoughts on the connections between Stoicism and Spinoza's ethics. They're doing similar but different things. Spinoza is not a Stoic. Neo-Stoicism was quite popular at the time. Stoics think that we actually, do have a self. We're not just a mode of God or anything like that. So there's a huge difference there with Spinoza. I also think Spinoza did not do himself any favors by presenting his ethics in this more geometrico. He thinks that that's going to make it easier to understand, and it becomes very difficult for a lot of people to understand. When you get to the later books, when he's talking about the emotions, Seneca is definitely not a Stoic, because the Stoics think that there are some good emotions. You'll find these discussed, for example, in Cicero and in places in Seneca, in Marcus Aurelius, and in these summaries of Stoic doctrine. They'll talk about the eupatheiai, right? Spinoza doesn't really have anything other than intellectual love of God. All the passions are bad for us in one way or another. So Spinoza, there's some similarities there, some big differences. I mean, you could say the same thing with Descartes, Gabriel, on practicing virtues, how do you know which virtue is at play in any given circumstance? Okay, so that's a good question. What's being asked of us? If we go back to these, things that like Seneca and Cicero and Arius said. So think about Cicero's on duties. All that is morally right arises from some one of four sources. It's concerned with full perception and intelligent development of the true. Is that what you're working with? Well, wisdom, right? Conservation of organized society. Well, okay, now we got justice, right? Greatness and strength of a noble and invincible spirit, or, for Seneca, fear to be suppressed, or in acts of endurance. There we got bravery or courage, right? You see how this works. When you read the texts, it really helps out with figuring out which virtue we need at one point. I'll also mention that the Stoics think that the virtues interpenetrate and inform each other. So, courage is not courage when wisdom or justice is lacking. Again, to talk about Proerasis, these guys who are like, I'm so tough and stuff like that. They're not Stoic, because actual courage, they don't have it. They have some other thing instead, a lack of human development that they're passing off as courage. And it's because it's not informed by wisdom and justice, right? So, all right, let's see what else we have here. Sergio, Marcus Aurelius talks about kindness, very much so, and love and affection. So again, the Stoics are not anti-emotional. They think that there are good emotions that we ought to be cultivating. And if you are a just person, you are going to be feeling those emotions. And they may also require, for example, courage to love somebody who's, connected with you, but who's kind of an a-hole. That takes perseverance. That's part of courage, right? To do what Epictetus tells you. I mentioned, right, Epictetus doesn't talk about virtue, but it's implicit in his ideas. In that passage where he says you can pick things up by one handle or another, your brother is a prick to you. Are you going to look at them as being a prick and respond to them accordingly? Or are you going to say, well, they're my brother, I can be a good brother to them? That takes courage, right? Moderation or temperance might come in as well. That might inform justice. Not eating like a pig and consuming lots of resources so that you can actually offer them to those who are needy. Moderation or temperance is going to help you with that, right? Being in a good relationship where you can develop intimacy. The Stoics thought that was quite important. It could be part of friendship. Musonius Rufus actually says that within a marriage, it's not just about making babies or sexual pleasure. It's about developing friendship. Not being able to, as we say, keep it in your pants would be a big impediment to that. And so moderation might really help that out. So the virtues are interconnected with each other. All right, so Nemanja says there's not so many letters from Seneca. Why not read them all? Yeah, if you want to be a Stoic or you want to practice Stoicism, sooner or later, you do need to read through Seneca's letter collection, and it's well worth doing. There's so many people that seem to be like afraid of taking on difficult texts, so they avoid Seneca and they avoid Cicero and they avoid Epictetus and they only read Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is at the end of things, right? He is actually, drawing on Epictetus. So why not go to Epictetus? Why not go to Cicero? Why not go to these other great people? I'm not knocking Marcus, but he's, if you have to choose between reading Seneca's letters and not even reading any of other Seneca's stuff and reading the Meditations, the letters should win every time. Same thing with Epictetus's discourses. All right, Mark has a question here. Do Stoic concepts of wisdom include both practical or theoretical wisdom, or do they distinguish prudence? They include both, and they use Sophia, which we often translate as sort of like theoretical wisdom, and Phronesis, which we often translate as practical wisdom, because this is an Aristotelian distinction. They often use these synonymously, as does, by the way, Plato. There is no, absolute radical distinction as we find in Aristotle, and it doesn't even really hold up that well in Aristotle. The account of Sophia in Nicomachean Ethics Book 6 is kind of incoherent. But in any case, yeah, the use of our minds as both practical and theoretical aspects to it. Just skipped a little bit. There was a nice remark here that I wanted to come to. Okay, so Jordan says thought is work, thought is labor. Yes. Thinking is work that requires courage, the aspects of it that we call like, endurance and, overcoming your fears is important, but also perseverance, right? You have to keep working at it. And great works, great literature, philosophy, really anything worth studying, you have to apply yourself. You're not going to get it immediately. Or if you do, you're probably getting the wrong thing because it takes work, right? So, all right. Sergio says, I think theoretical wisdom is part of logic, which they studied, but I don't know if it counts as the cardinal virtue of wisdom of Phronesis. It absolutely does. You can't do logic without developing Phronesis for the Stoics. Logic, ethics, and physics, 3 different areas, all interfused again, too. And we know very little of the Stoic logic and physics, by the way, compared to the Stoic ethics. In part because, what we do have is pretty fragmentary. So anybody, I'm going to put in a little rant here. Anybody who's claiming, oh, you have to study the Stoic physics and all the ethics is based on that, they're full of crap. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're being very dogmatic and doctrinaire about stuff that we just simply don't have enough texts about, You can study the Stoic ethics without going too far into the Stoic physics, what we do possess of it. And logic fits into that as well. Mark says, I'm not sure if you mentioned, and I missed it, but are there any Stoics who discuss piety as a virtue? Definitely. I mean, we mentioned that it fits in there in these discussions about justice. Piety is part of that. Epictetus, there's a lot of discussions about how we ought to orient ourselves towards God and understand God and what the implications are for us and other human beings. Like, for example, slaves, right? Slaves are also sons and daughters of God, or they have that bit of the divine in them. Seneca also talks about this as well. So piety is something that is robustly explored, I would say. Now, that granted, the Stoic God is not the God of, what we often call traditional theism. And by that, we mean these monotheistic religions like Judaism and Christianity and Islam, where you have a transcendent God, who's to some degree outside of the universe, precedes the universe, acts immanently within it. You can pray to them. Stoics aren't big on prayer or anything like that. But how can you be pious then? Well, try to act like God. Don't be a prick to people. Be the opposite of that. Be good to people, right? Now, Mark also says it's something I wish Aristotle wrote more about. And, Aristotle does talk about, he doesn't talk about the piety much. He talks about, God is the final end, drawing other things in. There's also like lowercase g gods. The Stoics also have that idea as well, but we don't have that much of their cosmology, and it's kind of hard to relate to anyway. Sergio, what makes the Stoics change some things from the original conception of Plato's cardinal virtues? They have a different anthropology. They have different preoccupations. There's no one single thing. And as a matter of fact, the Stoics, just like the Platonists, just like the Aristotelians, they are traditions that have a lot of development going on in them. If you read Plato and then you read Plutarch, a Middle Platonist, you're going to see some serious advances being made beyond just Plato. And then go to Plotinus, a Neoplatonist, right? Or even look at Simplicius's commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion, a Neoplatonist reading a Stoic work, and you're going to see further and further development going on. Same thing with the Aristotelian tradition, same thing with the Stoic tradition. Zeno did not say everything that needed to be said at the very start, and then the other Stoics just kind of mumbled along for, 500, 600 odd years. No, they kept on rethinking stuff and reworking it and adding to it. And this is the way that legitimate traditions in philosophy actually function. So, Eric, what makes the virtues desirable? I don't know. Do you not want to be wise or just or courageous or temperate? It's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? There isn't a beyond the virtues to make them desirable. These are the sort of things that if you want to actually have a good life, you need to have. And you probably want other people to have so they're not pricks to you too, right? Or burdens upon you, and they can do their own things. I'm being a little facetious here, but there's something actually wrong with the way the question is set up. It betrays a kind of, you could call it category mistake, right? The virtuous life is the good life for the Stoics. And so we need the virtues. This is a really basic thing for virtue ethics, something that we find, again, in the Platonist and the Aristotelian and the Stoic, and even the Epicureans think that you need virtues. Now, for them, they're instrumental, right? You need prudence so you don't do stupid stuff that makes your life less pleasant. You need justice so you're not going to get thrown in jail. You need courage so you can actually say no to some pleasures and thereby say yes to more. But they're kind of outliers. Most virtue ethicists view the virtues as sort of fundamentally basic and as traits that are admirable and traits that over time are going to make us happy, All right, Zach, Art, is there a formal practice of virtue in Stoicism of virtues in the way that Buddhists practice mindfulness and seated meditation? Well, some Buddhists practice mindfulness and seated meditation. Some practice it as they're doing work. That's one option in Chan or Zen Buddhism. And mindfulness is a kind of empty thing unless you add in all the other, sort of things that go along with it. It's just preparatory to ethical disciplines and visualization, and if you're doing Pure Land Buddhism, chanting and stuff like that. So I would say you don't really compare those. They're not the same. Is there a formal practice? I don't think that Stoicism has a formal practice of the virtues. The idea is get into situations and figure out what the hell you need to do. And you can tie this in with like negative visualization. When Epictetus says, whatever situation you get into, this is in the Enchiridion, look within yourself and figure out what you need to deal with it. And then he talks about virtues, doesn't he? You see a attractive body, what do you need? Temperance, right? So, there's, you could say it's formalizable, but there's no one single thing that like cuts across everything, the way that, say, meditation would, right? Not that you couldn't meditate on the virtues. Khalid says conscious awareness of the Stoic virtues seems to be a crucial part of practicing Stoicism, but I wonder if one can be an incidental Stoic. I don't know what an incidental Stoic would be, but I'll put it to you this way: the more that you're making these central, from the Stoic perspective, the better off you're going to be, right? And these take development. I mean, the Stoics, this is a separate topic that we'll get into at another time. The Stoics have this point of view that's really paradoxical, that like either you're virtuous or you're vicious. There's nothing in between. And I think that is just an idea that it really renders the ethics incoherent. And you notice that Seneca and Cicero and even Epictetus don't really buy this. And those are, pretty important heavy hitters. So the evidence is if they don't buy it, we don't actually have to buy it too. But, you can say there's a continuum, right? If you're only like reading about this once in a while and you're not actually trying to practice the virtues and you're not engaging in some self-scrutiny, oh, was I virtuous in that situation, or was I being vicious, or somewhere in between, you're probably not going to make much progress. And then you can say, well, why are you doing it? Why talk about being an incidental Stoic? Just live your life. You don't have to clutter it up with, adding a few life hacks or anything. If you really just want to like, enjoy yourself and not think about stuff, or be an Epicurean then, right? Or if you really just want to study things, you don't want to do a lot of practical application, go dilettante that sort of thing over there, and chat with people on Twitter about it. I kind of think with Stoicism, as with any other intentional way of life, you got to put something into it if you want to get anything out of it, right? So all right. Mark, are there any classically informed contemporary Stoic thinkers you would recommend? Any texts in particular? Yeah, there's a whole bunch. I mean, if you want stuff that's challenging, you could, really look at Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism, but that is quite a very challenging work. A lot of the people that we've had as speakers at StoicCon over the years are really well worth reading. Margaret Graver's book on Stoicism and Emotion is just an amazing piece, super well researched. And you notice that she is actually one of the translators, that's her name right there, right, of Seneca's letters in the University of Chicago edition. You also notice Anthony Long there too. He's got a lot of great books. John Sellers, a lot of great works on Stoicism. There's more popular stuff as well, like Massimo Pigliucci's How to Be a Stoic, Donald Robertson, How to Be a Roman Emperor, Stoicism and CBT. Tim Laban, another member of the modern Stoicism team. You notice that a lot of these people are in the organization, Modern Stoicism. Tim Laban has some good stuff. There's also, I'd be leery. There's a lot of like not good stuff out there because people jumped on the Stoic bandwagon and then wrote books that were kind of not well informed or schlocky or basically just doing life hack stuff. I've done a few reviews of them, so you want to be a little bit careful about that, right? And again, how do you know that any of these are any good? You look at the original text and see what the original texts have to say, right? Mark says, I recommend students try keeping a journal like Marcus Aurelius for a week as a type of ascesis, practicing personal reflection. This is a big thing. Yeah. Or it could be like doing the practice that Seneca recommends, which he took from the Pythagoreans, at night, do an examination of conscience. Now that's a Christian way of talking about it, because the Christians did similar things. A lot of Christian practices actually, originated with the Platonists or the Stoics or the Epicureans. Thinking like running over the day and being like, did I screw up? Man, how did I go off how did I lose my temper with this person, right? And you think about it, that is often, yeah, very, very helpful, right? Philip, does the notion of proerasis have a place within the Stoic system of ethics? Yeah, big place, from Epictetus onward, right? It's not really discussed in Seneca, although Seneca does have voluntas, which is covering similar ground. Um, it's not playing a big role in Marcus Aurelius. And interestingly, the summaries of Stoic ethics don't really talk about it because until Epictetus picks it up and makes it absolutely central to his work, his version of Stoicism, it's more of an Aristotelian term. Aristotle uses it in the Nicomachean Ethics. As a matter of fact, my collaborator and fellow editor of Stoicism Today, Harold Kavli, and I have done a lot of work on proerasis in the Stoic, in the Aristotelian, and in later Platonist traditions, including a presentation just down the road at Marquette University on proerasis and its development in Aristotle, Epictetus, Alexander of Aphrodisias, and then Simplicius. So yeah, it's an important notion. Proerasis means something like faculty of choice. Epictetus makes it the center of what you are. So it's basically the same thing as the hegemonikon, the ruling part, which is also the rational part. So there's this, again, interfusion in Epictetus of proerasis and these other things that are viewed as the most central part of ourself, right? Mark said, I was thinking recently about how many people want to denounce the good as tyranny and the lack of justice this betrays. I feel McIntyre was right. We need the virtues to moderate our practices, and I think Stoicism contributes to developing that. Yeah, a lot of people are very mixed up about the good. And that's, I mean, the good news is that's always been the case for human beings. The bad news is that's always been the case for human beings. And this is what moral theory and practice helps to work out. And you're not going to like change the whole world by practicing Stoicism any more than you will with any other intentional way of life. But you can work on the part of the world that's messed up, that's you, and the things that you can influence around you, and you can make them better. And the virtues are needed for that. Now, it's interesting you bring up McIntyre because Anthony Long has this wonderful, wonderful piece, which can be found in his book, Stoic Studies, but you can also find it in other places, where he criticized McIntyre's After Virtue for two things. One was getting Stoicism wrong, and he's right about that. Other people have pointed out that McIntyre didn't get Stoicism right any more than he got, he got some things right and he got some things wrong. Viewing it as sort of proto-Kantianism as just a form of deontology and not a form of virtue ethics, that's incorrect, right? Long also pointed out that exactly the sort of neo-Aristotelian community that McIntyre is suggesting in After Virtue is being provided by a rival tradition, Stoicism, in the present, right? And that's a really great thing to point out. I would also say that Neoplatonism or middle to Neoplatonism offers us a similar possibility as well. So, it's really quite good what Long has to say about that. I don't know if McIntyre ever did respond to that. Eric Sierra asks, what do you think of William Irvine's books? They're okay. I think that different people have different emphases. I don't think, for one thing, I don't think we need to have a trichotomy of control. I've written about this elsewhere. Epictetus already has enough robust resources for articulating the so-called dichotomy of control a lot better. Irvine, I'll just put it to you this way. I've met him. I've interacted with him. I think his books are, good. They're not my go-to. And I don't take him as somebody who's, for me, like a major interlocutor, but that's not anything against him. You can only like engage with so many people, right? So, all right. Any other questions or comments that people have? We got about 5 minutes left. A lot of good ones here. Like I said, we'll continue doing these monthly. And if people really get into it, maybe we'll do it more than monthly, right? Bottom head, what about Emerson? Emerson's not a Stoic. Emerson is a transcendentalist. So I don't know what the what about means. The transcendentalists read the Stoics, sometimes got them right, sometimes got them wrong. It was very common in 19th and 20th century philosophy and culture, kind of widely to get the Stoics kind of half right, half wrong, until people started looking more closely at Stoicism. Emerson is an interesting thinker. I think the Transcendentalists are well worth reading. Very important part of American philosophy. They show you that American philosophy is not all pragmatism. Not that there's anything wrong with pragmatism either. I like James and Royce and Peirce. Not as big on Dewey. Went to Southern Illinois University and actually worked at the Dewey Center, so we had Dewey kind of shoved down our throats. And I'm not quite as big on him, but they fit into that spectrum. Any other questions, comments people want to bring up? Oh, okay. Mark says, fun question for you. What piece of faux stoicism, false stoicism, you've come across peeved you off the most? You've mentioned there's some strange popular depictions of stoicism floating about. Yeah, I would say it's less a one single thing. Part of what I really dislike, and I think rightly so, and by the way, you can be stoic and dislike things. You can condemn things as a stoic. You can say this is garbage. You can use language like calling somebody an asshole if they actually are objectively an asshole. I would say the notion that stoicism can be summarized as life hacks is probably the most poisonous idea out there, because it's ready made for an internet generation where listicles are the thing, and a lot of it shows the opposite of wisdom, folly, right? A vice. And I think that some of it also shows the opposite of courage, cowardice. It takes courage to actually do the work, to read the text and then write about it and face the fact that you're not going to get as many views or, good responses, right? As somebody who just puts, copies a few things and puts together some fake quotes and stuff like that into a video. That takes some stick-to-itiveness, to use one of my old teachers' things to talk about fortitude. And I would say that that's sort of at the core of it, the notion that you can cheat, you can get away without doing the work and still reap the rewards. That's a bad thing to do. It's a bad thing for the people who are doing it for themselves, right? Because they're not developing as human beings. It's a bad thing to put out there as a model for other people, and it crowds out the good work that so many people are doing on Stoicism. And it makes it more difficult for people who are genuinely seeking to find the good stuff, right? So, yeah, Mark says as a Stoic, you should hopefully dislike vice at least. I mean, yeah, and you can dislike it in a measured way. You don't have to say, oh, this is the most terrible thing ever. That's kind of silly, right? But you can recognize it as a bad, right? As something evil, as stemming from vice, right? So, all right, Bottomhead says, I was thinking of Emerson's line, greatness is the perception that virtue is enough. Sure. I mean, that's not necessarily unique to Stoics, right? An Aristotelian, a Platonist can say that as well. Lots of people who are friends of virtue can say that. It's not a purely Stoic matter. All right, so it's 1:00. I've got to get to some other work. Thanks to everybody for joining me for this, and we'll definitely schedule another one of these for next month. If there's enough interest, maybe we can do them more regularly than that. It's almost inexhaustible, the number of concepts that we can explore. Even with virtue, there's a lot of stuff we haven't really gone into here. So everybody who's saying thanks, you're very welcome. And I will see Everybody else, down the line somewhere else.